They didn't just kill William Wallace. They turned his death into a show, a public event so brutal that even hardened soldiers looked away. On the morning of August 23, 1305, London was awake early. Word had spread through the streets that the most hated man in England was going to die, and everyone wanted to watch. Merchants closed their shops, families brought their children, and the city gathered to witness the punishment of a traitor. But William Wallace wasn't a traitor. He had never sworn loyalty to the English king. He was a man who refused to kneel, and that refusal terrified the most powerful ruler in the world. By the time Wallace was dragged into the square at Smithfield, he was barely recognizable. His hair was matted, his body beaten, but his eyes were still fixed forward. Witnesses said there was no fear in him, only exhaustion, the kind that comes when a man has already accepted death. The crowd expected him to beg. He didn't. Instead, he stared straight ahead as the executioner prepared the ropes and iron. The silence was so deep that even the wind seemed to stop. Then with a single command it began. What followed wasn't a simple execution. It was a message, a warning from a king to anyone who dared to dream of freedom. And yet, the message didn't work. Because that day, in the middle of London, something went wrong. The man they wanted to erase became impossible to forget, and his death would go on to haunt an empire. Before the name William Wallace became a symbol of defiance, he was just another man living under the shadow of occupation. Late 13th century Scotland was not a free country. It was a fractured land, caught between rival nobles and the iron grip of England's King Edward the Firker, the man the Scots would come to call Hammer of the Scots. Edward was ruthless, methodical, and obsessed with control. After forcing the Scottish nobles to swear allegiance, he believed the rebellion was over. But rebellions don't die with oaths, they die with fear. And fear was something Wallace refused to feel. He was born around 1270, the son of a minor noble. Nothing about his early life predicted rebellion. But when English soldiers began enforcing brutal taxes, burning villages, and taking hostages, something inside him broke. When an English sheriff reportedly killed the woman Wallace loved, he struck back. That single act, personal revenge, became the spark that lit a national fire. Wallace gathered farmers, blacksmiths, and outlaws, men with nothing to lose. With crude weapons and iron determination, they began ambushing English patrols, striking and disappearing into the forests. Within months, his name spread across Scotland like a rumor carried by the wind. Then came the battle that changed everything, Stirling Bridge. 1297 against overwhelming odds, Wallace led a ragtag force of Scots to victory, slaughtering a professional English army by using the terrain against them. The victory humiliated Edward III. For the first time, the world saw that England could bleed. Wallace was declared guardian of Scotland. He had gone from outlaw to national leader, but power came with a price. The Scottish nobles, jealous and divided, began turning against him. A year later, his forces were crushed at Falkirk. The nobles abandoned him. His army scattered. Wallace disappeared into the wild, hunted across the land he'd fought to free. For years, he became a ghost, appearing in villages, leading ambushes, always one step ahead of capture. But betrayal comes not from enemies. It comes from those who once swore loyalty. And in 1305, betrayal found him. It happened quietly. No sword fight, no chase, no glory. William Wallace was betrayed, not by an Englishman, but by a fellow Scot, a noble who traded his freedom for silver and safety. One night in August 1305, Wallace was ambushed near Glasgow. He was surrounded, shackled, and dragged across the border in chains. From that moment, he was no longer a man. He was a trophy. The English didn't just want to kill him. They wanted to unmake him, to take the legend that had terrified their armies and grind it into the dirt for all to see. He was paraded through towns on horseback, chained so tightly that he could barely breathe. Crowds spat at him, soldiers jeered, and children were made to throw mud. By the time he reached London, he hadn't slept properly in weeks. His body was covered in sores, his face bruised and swollen. But his eyes, witnesses said, still burned with defiance. At the Tower of London, he was locked in a damp stone cell. Rats crawled over his feet. The air smelled of rot and rust. The guards made sure he heard the clanging of chains every night, a cruel reminder of what awaited him. The interrogation began almost immediately. Wallace was accused of treason. But he laughed and said, "I could not be a traitor, for I never swore loyalty to Edward." That single sentence infuriated the English court. To them, it wasn't just defiance, it was blasphemy against the crown itself. They could have executed him quickly, but Edward wanted more. He wanted to make Wallace's death an example that would echo across every corner of Scotland. He wanted fear to live longer than freedom. So they planned a ritual of punishment, a spectacle designed to destroy not only Wallace's body but his memory. The method was ancient and forbidden in most of Europe. It was reserved for traitors, heretics, and monsters. It was called being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Every detail was decided in advance. The route he would take through the city, the words the herald would shout, the order of the punishment. The king's message was clear. This would not be justice. This would be obedience through horror. And on the morning of August 23rd, 1305, the show began. The morning air in London was heavy, not warm, not cold, just the kind that clings to your skin and never lets go. Crowds lined the narrow streets of Smithfield waiting. Vendors sold food. Children climbed barrels to see above the crowd, but this wasn't a celebration. It was a warning. When Wallace was dragged into view, bound to a wooden hurdle and pulled by horses through the filth of the streets, the noise of the crowd turned from cheers to silence. He wasn't the monster they had imagined. He was gaunt, exhausted, human, tied to a post. His clothes torn, his body covered in bruises. Wallace was forced to listen as the royal herald read the charges. "William Wallace, you are guilty of treason, murder, and rebellion against your rightful king." Wallace didn't answer. He just looked up, his expression unreadable. The executioner stepped forward. The crowd tensed. This wasn't going to be quick. Everyone knew that. They lifted him onto the gallows, and not to kill him, but to almost kill him. He was hanged until he was barely conscious and then cut down, gasping for air. Every breath was a fight, every sound, a blur of screams and laughter. Then came the next stage, the drawing. His body, weak and trembling, was tied to a table. The executioner moved slowly, deliberately performing each act not as punishment, but as ceremony. The goal wasn't death, it was degradation. They wanted to strip away everything that made William Wallace human, and yet, through all of it, he never begged. Witnesses said he looked past the crowd, as if he was already somewhere else. One chronicler wrote that when the executioner paused, waiting for him to speak, Wallace whispered something that no one around him could forget. "Tell them, I was free." Those 5 words silenced the square. Even the executioner hesitated. And that was the moment everything changed. Because in that instant, Wallace's death stopped being a punishment and became a message. Not the king's message, but his, a message written not in ink, but in blood and courage. The final act was completed swiftly. His body was cut apart, his head placed on London Bridge, and his limbs sent to Scotland, displayed in 4 cities as a warning. But instead of fear, something else spread, something the English crown couldn't control. Stories, rumors, whispers that said Wallace never screamed, that he died with a smile, that the man who refused to kneel had defeated the most powerful empire on earth, not with an army but with his silence. When the execution ended, the square slowly emptied. People went home. Merchants reopened their stalls, and London carried on as if nothing had happened. But something had changed, not in England, but across the border. Word of Wallace's death spread through Scotland like a cold wind. Each town that received a piece of his body was meant to be reminded of English power. Instead, they remembered his defiance. In Stirling, mothers whispered his name to their children. In Dundee, soldiers carved the symbol of a rising lion on walls at night. Even in Edinburgh, under the watch of English soldiers, the people refused to bow their heads when they passed the banners of King Edward. The English had tried to erase a man. Instead, they had created a legend. Wallace became more than human. He became the embodiment of everything Scotland had lost. and everything it still hoped to be. To some, he was a martyr. To others, a ghost that refused to die. Even Edward the man who ordered the execution, could not escape the consequences. He believed that killing Wallace would end rebellion, once and for all. But in the years that followed, uprisings grew stronger. Scotland did not submit. And in 1314, less than a decade after Wallace's death, Robert the Bruce led Scottish forces to victory at the Battle of Bannockburn, the decisive moment that secured Scotland's independence. When the English army fell, soldiers swore they heard the cry of Wallace echo across the battlefield, though the man himself had been gone for years. History doesn't always remember the victors, but it always remembers those who refuse to break. Wallace's story was carried across generations, first by word of mouth, then by song, then by story. Even centuries later, his defiance became the heart of Scotland's identity, not because he lived, but because of how he faced death. What the English crown intended as terror became something sacred, a lesson written in blood, passed from one generation to the next. You can chain a man, you can destroy his body, but you cannot silence what he stood for. History remembers William Wallace as a hero, but heroes aren't born. They're made by the cruelty of the world around them. Wallace never set out to be a symbol. He didn't crave glory or legend. He simply couldn't accept the idea of living on his knees. That decision, simple, human, and stubborn, changed the fate of a nation. His executioners believed they had destroyed him. They believed the pain, the humiliation, and the fear would erase his name forever. But suffering has a strange way of transforming men. Sometimes, the more pain the world gives them, the more powerful they become in death. Wallace's story was never about revenge. It was about endurance. It was about a man who understood that real freedom isn't granted. It's claimed, even if it costs everything. In the years that followed, his name became something whispered before battle, carved into stone, and sung by soldiers who knew they might never see another dawn. He became the voice of every man or woman who ever refused to give in. Centuries later, his name still stands as a question, one that every generation must answer for itself. What does it truly mean to be free? Because freedom isn't just a word in books or speeches. It's a choice, and choices have consequences. Wallace faced those consequences alone, in a city that wanted to forget him. And yet, over 700 years later, London has forgotten the faces of the men who killed him, but not the face of the man who would not kneel. That's the power of defiance. That's what the English crown could never understand. They didn't just execute a man that day. They created a symbol that no empire could destroy. William Wallace's body was destroyed, but his defiance never died. Every empire that came after tried to bury him in their history books, yet his story kept resurfacing. Because you can silence a man's voice, but you can't silence what he stands for. His final moments weren't just about death. They were about resistance, a reminder that freedom, once awakened, cannot be tortured back into submission. When you walk through London today, there are no monuments marking where he was executed. The world moves fast and history forgets easily. But the ground remembers, and if you listen closely, beneath the sound of the city, it almost feels like the silence still holds his last breath, a whisper that says, "Tell them, I was free, so what do you think? Did they destroy William Wallace, or did they make him immortal?" Tell us in the comments below, and if you want to uncover more of the stories that history tried to hide, the kind written not in ink but in pain, you know where to find them. This is Torture Relics, where the past still screams.